Hey, it's Laura. Welcome back to my channel where I want to help you know God and make Him known. In this chapter 26, we get a glimpse at the depravity of our souls. We get to see several stories of different people and how they relate to Jesus and get a peek inside their souls. And by looking at them, we see our reflection. All right, let's dig in. Chapter 26 starts off when Jesus had finished saying all of this. So this is referring back to chapter 25. So if you haven't watched that video, make sure to watch that video. And then he brings up the Passover and how it's going to take place in 2 days. And then he tells about what's going to happen 2 days from now. He says, the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Pretty comforting that he lets them know over and over what is going to happen. He's going to be crucified so that they can find comfort and not be totally like, what? This came out of left field. God's going to remind them that he said this. All right, so let's jump down to verse 6. It says, while Jesus was in Bethany, so Bethany is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. So remember back what he did with Lazarus. Lazarus was dead, and he raised him from the dead. So this is where he's at. This is the town. These are the people in that town saw. If they didn't see, they heard about what happened to Lazarus. Those are the people in this house right now. He was at the house of Simon, a man who had a serious skin disease in those days. That was most likely leprosy. And a woman approached him with an alabaster jar full of expensive fragrant oil. What did she do? Well, she poured it on his head. All right, now that's just funny. I mean, could you, put yourself in this shoe. You saw this man raise Lazarus from the dead. All right, maybe you can relate to her. Maybe you're her and you want to give Jesus your very best, or maybe you're someone sitting there. But this lady comes in and starts pouring oil on his head. I mean, it's just kind of funny. You could just see Jesus like, I'm sure it's not just like a little drop here or there. Anyway, as he was reclining at the table, when, verse 8, the disciples saw it, they were indignant. They were ticked off. Why? They say in their heart, why this waste? She's wasting, wasting. I mean, maybe it's just how I grew up or our family today, or maybe it's American culture, but like waste, like we just shouldn't waste, right? We should recycle. So it's that same type of like, she's wasting all that. This could have been sold for a great deal and given to the poor. We still can have that same attitude, right? Like, look at this beautiful church building. What a waste. All that money could have been given to the poor. It's that. That's the very heart condition of the disciples. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, all right, so here's this lady. We're like in the room here, okay? So the lady's right here pouring oil on it. These people are whispering and they're all mad. Why? She's such a wasting, And Jesus points at them, looks at them, says to them, he starts bragging on the lady here. She has done a noble thing for me. You will always have the poor, but you won't always have me. So he publicly is correcting the disciples as he's bragging on the lady here. How amazing, right? And then he goes on to explain, she's preparing me for my burial. Brings it back to, hey, remember I'm dying? Remember how I told you I was going to be crucified? I just told you that. And then I assure you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. All right. He is bragging on the faith of this lady, and he wants others to brag about her. So much so, he wants the whole earth and everywhere that the gospel is proclaimed to hear about the faith of this lady. This is crazy because what were they doing? They were actually criticizing her worship. Here she is worshiping Jesus, and it didn't look the way they thought it should look, and they called her gift a waste. Have you ever looked at how somebody else is worshiping Jesus and criticized it? That's the heart of the disciples here. All right, what comes out of us? What comes out of us when people are worshiping Jesus in a way that we're not real comfortable with? What comes out of us? Well, we see what comes out of Judas, because then in verse 14, it says, then one of the 12, so here he's provoked, the man called Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me? All right, what are you willing to give me? So he's so provoked by this lady's worship and how Jesus responds and brags about her and not about the disciples, how he corrects the disciples, that he is moved to betrayal, that his heart is so, yuckiness comes out to the point he acts on it, right? In James, we see the progression of sin, and here it does it finally when sin gives birth, it gives birth to death. And that's what's happening. Sin gave birth right here, and now it's leading to death. So he goes, says, what are you willing to give me? And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver is the price of a slave. That's talked about in the Old Testament when a slave was gored to death by an ox. Like that's what in a court of law, that's what they were supposed to pay the person whose slave died, was 30 pieces of silver. And then from that time, he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him. All right, then it goes on, betrayal at the Passover. On the first day of unleavened bread, the first day, so Passover is this 8-day long feast. Here's the first day, or called unleavened bread. And the very first day, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to prepare the Passover? So he says, go into the city to a certain man, verse 18, if you're following along. Go into the city to a certain man, he said, and tell him, the teacher says, my time is near. I'm celebrating the Passover at your place with my disciples. Okay, say you're like that man's wife. Okay, how do you feel about uninvited guests? Or your husband's like, oh yeah, come over for dinner tonight. My wife is going to make you a big dinner. That's here's this wife, so go tell this guy that I'm coming to your house tonight. And so that's kind of interesting. So the disciples did that. And then when evening came, so he's at this guy's house. I wonder how that guy and his wife were feeling. I wonder if they were excited or if they were like nervous or if she was mad. I wonder. That'll be a fun conversation in heaven. Like, hey, tell me about what you were thinking, Maybe they were peeking in, trying to see what was going on. Maybe they sat in there with him. I don't know. There's lots of questions here. But this is what we do know. Here they are. When evening came, he was reclining at the table. Here he is reclining. This is a posture of like reclining. They're not all uptight and nervous and, they're reclining at the table with the 12. So while they're eating, this is casual. When you're at a table eating with people, it's a calm atmosphere that's really down to earth, right? And then he says, so I assure you, one of you is going to betray me. What? That would just be like, whoa, what are you talking about, Jesus? Say you're sitting at that table or you're peeking through the crack of the door, the lady who cooked the Passover. What would you think? Wouldn't you be startled? Like, whoa, where did this come from, Jesus? What are you talking about? So they're deeply distressed. Yes, of course. You'd be like, what are you talking about? And then each one of them is, surely not I. Surely not I. Surely not I. Then replied the one dipped in his hand with me. He's the one. So he actually points out, and then here you see, Jesus, they bump hands, and they know Jesus, or Judas, his betrayer, replied, surely not I. But what's interesting is sin will always be exposed. This was exposed. And an interesting thing in verse 25, Judas, his betrayer, called him rabbi. We never see Judas respond to Jesus and call him Lord. we only see him call him rabbi or teacher. He never calls him Lord. So that kind of lets you know where he's at in his heart. Interesting thing here, we see the disciples say, surely not I. We see Judas say, surely not I. And isn't that the cry of our hearts too? I would never do what that person did. I would never. But what do we see? What do we see? It continues to go on. So the Lord's Supper, and he talks about, he breaks this. He just exposed Judas. He's going to be betrayed. And then he takes the bread and he broke it and he gave it to the disciples, even Judas sitting there. And he says, take and eat. He's saying, I'm giving my body for you. You, the one that betrayed me. I'm giving it. And he knows what's to come. He knows they're all going to flee and all betray him not very long from now. And yet here he is saying, I'm going to give my body for you. And here's my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of your sin. So here he is. He knows full well of their sin. And yet he's forgiven. He's going to forgive them of their sins. So it's kind of like we see here our sin and our whole depravity, we are far more depraved than we ever could imagine. We are far more capable of doing horrible sin than we ever imagined. And yet, here we see Jesus offering more forgiveness and more grace than we ever dared hope. And then he starts to tell Peter, he pulls out Peter, guess what? You know, the surely not I, he says, surely tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. The very day that he says, surely not I, he cannot imagine doing something so horrible. And he wasn't even given that much time. And he did what he never thought he would be able to do. He denies Jesus. All right, so he tells him, tonight you're going to deny me. And then it goes into the prayer in Gethsemane, and we see the brokenness of Jesus. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he brings his disciples and says, sit with me here while I go and pray. Taking Peter and the sons of thunder, the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. And then he said to them, my soul is swallowed up in sorrow. Have you ever been there? Have you ever had your soul swallowed up in sorrow? Probably not to this extent, but I'm sure that seeing the brokenness in the world, I am sure that your soul has felt sorrow over the brokenness and pain in this world. That's what Jesus was feeling, to the point of death. So he took it to a step further. So he says to them, remain here and stay awake with me. Going a little further, he fell down, face down, and he prayed. And then he came back and he found them sleeping. Here, they just couldn't even keep their eyes awake. Like, have you ever just not even been able to keep, you've been so tired, you really need to stay awake, but you just can't keep your eyes awake? I've been there. You know, we want to look at these guys and be like, come on, guys, just stay awake and pray. Jesus just said he was deeply distressed to the point of death, and you can't even stay awake. It's so easy to be so critical. Yet, we have done the same thing. So what does he say? Verse 41, stay awake and pray so that you won't enter temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This is the key verse in the whole entire chapter. Watch and pray. Because the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. We are seeing over and over ourselves reflected in the depravity of these people. The depravity of criticizing other people's worship. The depravity of, saying, no way, I would never do something so horrible. No way would I deny you. Watch and pray. Watch and pray. Because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is so weak. And then he's betrayed. Here they come. Judas comes, betrays him. He's actually moving towards Judas. Crazy. He's moving towards his betrayer as he comes. And they have all their clubs and their swords, and he's like, put down your swords. And he reminds them in verse 53, do you think that I cannot call on my Father and he will provide me at once with more than 12 legions of angels? Like, he's reminding them, like, I'm going with you willingly. Like, I'm the boss here. Then he faces the Sanhedrin. He's falsely accused. And then we see Peter denies him 3 times, just like he just said earlier that day. First, it's to a servant. Second, it's to another woman. And then third, to just some other guy. And the third time, in verse 74, then he started to curse and swear. All right, so he's mad. Here's Peter. No, I would never. Cursing and swearing at someone because they're saying, you really are with Jesus. And he's saying, no, I'm not. Man. And then Peter remembered the words. He heard the rooster crow. He remembered the words of that Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. He wept bitterly. That's heartbreaking that he did the very thing that he said he could never do. This is a picture of us, that we are the desperate ones for Jesus. We are so desperate for him to save us, to rescue us from ourselves. We might think, I would never. But we would. We would. Our flesh is weak. That's why we need Jesus to rescue us from ourselves. So this is chapter 26. There is a good ending, but this is a really great time to really think about what is it in your life that you think, I would never. And just realize that your flesh is actually capable of that. So cling to Jesus and his strength. Look to him, watch, and pray that you would not fall into temptation. That you wouldn't enter into temptation because the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. So cling on the sufficiency of Jesus. Cling to him for strength, because we cannot do it of ourselves. Our strength is not adequate, but Jesus is. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe down below. If you're encouraged, or if God brought someone to your mind to share this with, please do. And I would love to hear from you in the comments too. So if you have other things that stood out to you, I love hearing from you. So comment below. All right, bye. Thanks for joining me.